Welcome to the Smart Divorce on Divorce Source Radio, helping you move forward with focus, hope, and confidence, saving you time, money, and your sanity as you build a better life post-divorce. I'm Steve Peck. Deborah Moskovich, divorce consultant, educator, and author of The Smart Divorce, brings you the leading experts and researchers in the divorce arena. We'll also be speaking with those in the trenches, people who've learned from their divorce and how their experience has changed their lives. And they would tell you for the better. Deborah's learned that divorce can be a beginning, even if it looks like an end. Divorce can be rich in opportunity to learn and grow from. And we're going to explore how to take this information and create a positive post-divorce life. And now, here's Deborah.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm fine, Deborah. How are you?
I've got another fascinating show for you today.
I know.
I'm very excited. You know, I think 2013 is going to be a changing year in the way we look at divorce. You know, it's not just divorce process, but how you manage the process in terms of the way you approach it and the way you think about it. And today we're going to talk about the religious aspects to divorce. So, you know, and cultural diversity, you know, people come into divorce with their own belief systems, their own values, and how does that impact the way the laws were developed? So I'm excited to have our guest, Fareen Jamal, who's a lawyer at Bales Beal. She's practicing matrimonial, estate, and civil litigation in Toronto. And I met Fareen at a presentation that I gave to a mediation training group, and I've been wowed by her ever since. She's brilliant. She is one of the most well-respected lawyers at such a young age because she thinks strategically, she's smart, she thinks outside of the box, she's settlement-oriented, and she has an area of expertise in terms of cultural diversity that she is trying to, you know, she's helping to educate other lawyers about how they approach this with their clients. And I think that this is a topic, while we've never discussed it, and I don't really see it in the media all that often, is that what happens when your values are so different, or you come from a different slant in terms of your beliefs. And we're going to talk about the Muslim divorce and Jewish divorce, and I'll share my own experience about getting a get.
And Deb, it's interesting that we don't think about that more prior to marriage. We're so in love, we just kind of gloss over that.
Yeah. And, you know, so what does that mean when there's intermarriage? And how does divorce then affect the parenting plan when you've got parents from two different religions and belief system? And so, you know, I don't know if that was something we're going to be able to talk about today, because I know that we've got so much to cover. You know, we'll probably have to have Fareen back, but there's so many different things to think about.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Fareen, welcome to the Smart Divorce on Divorce Source Radio.
Thank you, Steve.
So, Fareen, you know, what, if any, is the impact of a religious divorce on civil divorce? You know, like what, you know, so there's a couple of things. What does it mean for individuals who have a strong faith base in their religion and want to follow those beliefs into their divorce? Because after all, when they got married, you know, they were able to incorporate the customs and traditions into their marriage, but they can't into divorce, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that. There have been some changes to the law, not so recent, but the law, the legislation, is now recognizing religious divorce to some extent. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of that comes from the Jewish community and the get.
Right.
Because that's a religious divorce that's well understood. And in 2007, the Supreme Court of Canada heard a case called Brooker and Markovitz. And they dealt with the get. And it really raised the family bar's consciousness about religious divorce.
Okay, so I got a get. I'm Jewish. And, you know, that was really, really important to me, is to obtain this document. But you know what? When I went through my divorce, my Jewish beliefs didn't affect the way my civil divorce was handled. All it meant was, after I got my, it just happened. Like, and I guess you could get a get before you get the civil divorce. But after I got my divorce, I went to what's called a Beit Din. It's a house. It's with seven of, I guess, Toronto's most revered lawyers. It's like a tribunal, right? And they gave me my Jewish divorce, and it was basically a ceremony, a ritual on closing this chapter. There's no more marriage. Now, the rabbis tried to convince me to stay married. And, that's their job, is to keep the family together. But, we went through this ceremony where you had a scribe handwrite a document on the divorce. And, and then there was a ceremony in terms of how my now ex-husband gave me this document and how, I accepted and everything else. And that was the get. But nothing about the get impacted the way our settlement was created. Yeah, it was very ceremonial.
Yeah, no, I've heard that, after 2007, the legislation, both our provincial and federal legislation, recognized the get as a religious barrier to remarriage. Right? I mean, you need the get in order to get remarried, and so not giving a get was a barrier to remarriage, and so they've recognized it as removing that barrier. But what was very clear after 2007 in that case was that the gets and the very ceremonial aspects of them, at the end of the day, they're moral obligations. They can be converted into legally binding obligations, and courts allow that. Like we recognize that and respect that now.
Right. And I think from, someone who is ultra-Orthodox in the Jewish religion, they cannot remarry without having a get. So that's why it's so important.
But does anyone not receive one?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes. There are people, and the terms, the terms for children who were born out of a marriage that was not received a get was called, a mamzer, and an aguna was a chained wife. I mean, they have all these terms and these, they're very stigmatic labels.
No, stigmatic in terms of the Orthodox community.
Yes.
And which is really important, Steve, to understand that, because if you have someone that is highly observant, you're putting barriers to them getting remarried. So some individuals would use that as leverage for, the divorce process. And as a matter of fact, Fareen, if you can help me out here, there have been men, because again, it goes back to like the way that the religion manages, or the way that the laws have been written in terms of a get, but men are the ones that have to give the get to a woman.
Correct.
So if a man chooses, or the husband chooses not to give his wife a get, she's a chained wife, which is a guna. So there are a lot of issues behind that, especially for someone who is ultra-Orthodox. Someone who is not that observant, it's not a major issue, and you can still get divorced.
And I mean, let's be honest, 2007 wasn't that long ago, and that was the Supreme Court of Canada overturning the Quebec Court of Appeal. The Quebec Court of Appeal, so it's an appellate court. They said that the court shouldn't get into the religious thicket. I mean, the term that everybody would use was it's the religious thicket. They're not civil obligations; they're moral obligations, or obligations of your conscience. And the courts aren't going to wade into there. No, that's your problem. So you'd have all of these chained wives, or, they're not bastard children, but they'd be considered bastard children because you didn't actually get the get from the first husband. Until very recently, until the Supreme Court of Canada said, yes, absolutely, I'm sorry, even if they are moral obligations, you can convert your moral obligations into legal obligations. They become justiciable. Just because they have a religious aspect doesn't mean we're going to ignore them anymore. So that's a
right.
change in the last 5 years for Canada.
Yeah. And I would expect that it's not that different in terms of the outlook in the U.S. as well.
I agree, yeah.
So with that being said, I had a client not that long ago in my divorce coaching practice who was Muslim. And he said to me that, he gave his wife a dowry and wanted to ensure that because of divorce, he wanted to get that money back. How do you handle that? Like that, it's not really called a dowry, is it?
No, it's not. And so I wanted to just explain the terms a little bit as well. In the only way that I can explain the term is to use its correct name, which is
Right.
meher, right?
Yeah.
But meher is sometimes called mohor or maher. It's pronounced differently. And when it comes,
sorry, can I just get you off? Can I just cut you off? How do you spell those? Because I'm sure we've got a lot of listeners who would find this fascinating, want to do a little bit of research. How do you spell that?
So I spell meher M-A-H-R.
Yeah.
But some people spell it M-A-H-E-R.
Mm-hmm.
Some people spell it M-O-H-R. And there's even M-E-H-R. I've seen it several different ways and in different decisions as well.
Yeah.
So it's a Muslim tradition. It's an agreement that's entered into prior to marriage, so a marriage contract.
Now, would you?
Prenuptial agreement.
Okay, so you would include this into a prenup as well?
It is a prenup.
Oh, it is a prenup. Okay, so this is a Muslim prenup.
It's exactly.
Okay.
And it's concerning a sum of money that a groom promises to pay his bride in the event of a marriage breakdown or death. But it's the property of the wife. It becomes the property of the wife from the date of marriage. It's something that he promises to pay in the future.
Now, if someone was also constructing a prenup going into the marriage, so in terms of the civil aspect of marriage, would they incorporate the meher into that?
They could.
Yeah.
You could have two agreements. You could have it in one. Often, a lot of my clients have it in one. They say, we want to deal with a marriage contract dealing with X, Y, and Z, and the meher would be one of the aspects of it.
Okay.
Because it's how does it fit into the bigger picture?
Okay, great.
Okay, and so meher let's go back a step just before I explain the terms a little bit better. I think it would help if I emphasize that marriage in Islam and also in Judaism is a civil contract. There's nothing sacred about the solemnization of marriage that is familiar with the Christian traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Muslim wedding ceremonies, they could have a religious component, but it's not essential for an Islamic marriage. It's simply a contract. And like any other contract, it can be brought to an end by a simple divorce. Unlike in Christianity, in which there's sacraments, so it's indissoluble except in very rare circumstances.
Right.
So marriage and divorce, in fact, is actually talked about in the Quran, because the Quran talks about the fair treatment of divorced wives. So it's
really, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, even alimony, even maintenance is described in the Quran.
And how is it described?
It talks about the fair treatment and what would be considered fair, and depending on your interpretation, some interpret it as a certain number of months or how that would look like, but it's definitely discussed, and then how that's interpreted depends on your school of thought. Okay,
so and excuse my naivety because I don't really know a lot about this area, but and I don't mean to sound really uninformed, but I'm very naive about this. But and I'm really shocked to hear how wonderful that women are treated in the Quran and provided the equality, but that doesn't seem to be my perception of the way women are treated.
I know, what a misunderstanding. And especially when you look at even the meher, I think this is a key area where I see this great misunderstanding. So, you mentioned, you termed it as a dowry or a dower. And even I think when I explain these terms, you realize just how opposite that perception really is in some ways.
Right.
Right? In terms of the concept, the theory, how it's acted out in practice, that's where perhaps some of the assumptions come. But also you've got to remember that Islam is a very, very varied religion. I mean, it's a very, there is no one face to it. What's the word I'm looking for? It's very multifaceted.
Okay, so within Islam and is there a difference between Sunni, Shia, and Ismaili. And by the way, when I did my own research on Muslim divorce, because I taught a course on divorce, I thought the way that the Ismaili religion, is that the way I would say it, is handled the divorce is probably one of the most holistic ways. I thought that really, like, the courts should be looking at this, or people that are looking at divorce reform, because using the tribunal or a cab was...
You're very well informed, Deborah.
I think the due diligence, but it was fabulous, because the support that they provided a family was amazing, and you actually don't see this in the general public.
No, I think there are lots of communities that are, there are several Jewish communities, and I think of them as plural communities. There are several Muslim communities that are quite developed, and the Ismailis are definitely one of them. And you're right, their conciliation arbitration board is envied. It's a great process that's available to Ismailis.
Yeah.
So, and I agree with you. I think it's lovely. But yes, to answer your question, there is no to know the Muslim culture. I mean, there are so many sects of Islam, or divisions within their. I think sects would probably be the right word, but I worry that that's got its own connotations. But in Islam, there are the Shias, there are the Sunnis. It's doctrinal dispute. From a legal perspective, there's the interpretations of the religious principles to give legal meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I think in fact, better than sects, the best word would be schools of thought. There's different schools of thought. And the Shias and Sunnis divided on the death of, shortly after Prophet Muhammad died, and they divided in terms of how they were authority, who had authority, both spiritual and temporal.
Right.
And so there are all these divisions. And within the Sunnis, there are 4 schools of thought from a legal perspective, and within the Shias, there are schools of thought as well, and the Shias divided within their own lines as well. And the Ismailis all Ismailis are Shia. They are one division or one school of thought within the Shia school of thought.
Okay.
Does that help at all?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure, hugely. So going back to talking about the maher, then,
the maher is not dowry.
Okay.
A dowry, in Old English law, dowry was what the father of the wife paid to the groom.
Right.
So dowry is not a Muslim tradition. There is nothing that the father of the wife or the wife, frankly, pays to the groom in any Muslim tradition.
No, I think that's an important concept to understand, because when someone who's Muslim, goes to a lawyer, and a North American lawyer needs to really understand these concepts, so that they can manage it more effectively in the separation agreement, like know what it is that they're talking about. And do lawyers really understand
what their clients are talking about? Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's called dower instead of dowry, and that translation is also problematic. Dower is the Old English law. In married women in England and in Canada, they couldn't own property until the late 19th century. But dower was something under common law, was a husband's contribution to the wife on marriage. And on the husband's death, she'd be entitled to a dower. It was usually like a life interest in the husband's estate. So while he was alive, he could use his estate, and then upon her death, it would pass pursuant to the husband's will or the laws at that time. But dower is different from maher, because dower has a very limited recognition of women's rights, frankly. I mean, your husband has to die, and women can own property. Whereas maher is, first of all, it's the right of the wife. So the wife is recognized as an individual in her own right. The woman here is treated as an individual because she personally receives the maher, and she has independent legal status, which, frankly, North Americans didn't receive until the late 19th century. Whereas maher has existed since time immemorial.
Okay, so how do you help a couple then that's, going through divorce, they've got this maher, is whatever that they agreed to in their prenup legally binding?
So that'll depend on contract law.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That'll depend on what were the circumstances when the contract was entered into. Does it comply with contract law? Was there, was he informed? Was there any duress? Did he understand what he was signing? Did he understand what he was signing when he signed away whatever it was? Was this the day that they got married? Was it before? So all of the principles that we look at for validity of a contract. And then there's formal validity. Did he sign it? Did he all that kind of stuff as well?
So does this add more complication to the civil prenup, like the way that we would perceive a prenup in North America versus a Maher type prenup?
I don't think so. I mean, at the end of the day, a contract is a contract. I think of it as a contractual agreement between two consenting adults, which frankly is what marriage is. Right? It's the same thing. And in this prenup, they're just agreeing on what the husband is going to pay the wife if they separate or divorce, or if he dies.
So is it legally binding? Is a Maher legally binding in Canada?
Yes, it absolutely can be.
And in the U.S. as well, do you know? Is it legally binding in the U.S.?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, there have been cases in both circumstances. It starts to get interesting. The case law is very interesting in this area because, first of all, the courts were afraid to enter the religious thicket, and really courts misunderstood Islamic marriages if they thought there was any religious element to it, because, like I explained, that's a misunderstanding.
Right.
In Islam, marriage is a contract. So first of all, there had been that misunderstanding for many years. And then you had the courts not quite sure whether or not to do this in addition to support, in addition to equalization, or is it in lieu of? So these are the types of discussions that the courts have been grappling with.
Yeah, you said something interesting in one of the papers you wrote. You said Canadian courts have been divided on the enforcement of Maher. The challenge has been enforcing Canadian contract law while remaining sensitive to cultural and religious traditions. Yeah.
Well, because in contract law, right, some of the things that you require for contract law are insensitive to cultural traditions. I mean, in some traditions, such as financial disclosure is a big one, right?
Yeah.
Canadian contract law requires full financial disclosure. Otherwise, an agreement can get set aside.
Yeah, and I would think that's the same in the U.S. as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in some cultural traditions, it's just not practiced. It's not normal to obtain full financial disclosure. So the question is, how much is enough?
Now, that's fascinating to me because it is critical in civil law, family divorce, for full financial disclosure. So when you say in some cultures, like how much is enough, then wouldn't they be not abiding by the rules?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why they're grappling with it. So, I mean, I think it's a dialogue between both. I think the Maher agreements have changed sometimes to reflect some of these discussions, and I think in some ways the Canadian courts have become more sensitive to these issues. I mean, in 1987, the first time actually it was a Nova Scotia court that was presented with a Maher issue, it totally misunderstood what Maher was, and it called Maher the morning gift. Here's a morning gift that the husband gives the wife, and it's it's unenforceable. It offends gender equity principles, or something to that effect. And what a misunderstanding! And then gender is part of the cultural misunderstanding, because gender is a key cultural issue. And the Canadian contract law, this is another issue that it grapples with. Because in some, coming back to the Maher, in some Muslim schools of thought, if a wife seeks the divorce, she would forfeit her right to the Maher, unless she can prove that her husband is at fault. And in Canada and the U.S., we have no-fault divorces.
Right.
So there's a difference of opinion about whether a woman would forfeit her right to Maher if she initiates the divorce.
Complicated.
It is. It's interesting. It's challenging. It's what keeps us interested.
Yeah. So how do you suggest to our listeners there who have a Maher and they're looking to divorce, like what do they look for in legal counsel?
for counsel who know what a maher is,
Yeah.
who understand it, who can present it to the court. At the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, culture is an ability to see someone the way they see themselves. So you're looking for a culturally sensitive lawyer who can see you the way you see yourself and also present to the court these principles in basic terms that the court can understand.
Okay, so that is if you go to court. But what about if you mediate or just negotiate through your lawyers?
Yeah, so you're looking for people who understand it. I mean, the good news is that there's a lot more information out there today about what a maher is. So there's, people like myself, there are several people who are trying to dispel the myths or misunderstandings related to maher agreements and just maher generally. And if you find counsel, there's several mediators are alive to this issue if they've ever had Muslim clients. And so they're aware of the situation, and then they would work through these issues, which are, how was the contract entered into? Does it comply with the contractual obligations? And then, is this over and above what would ordinarily be paid, and how is it going to be paid?
Now, how enforceable is maher if you were married outside of North America, where this contract is just part of the culture of divorce, but you come to Canada now or the U.S., is the maher still enforceable?
It is, and this is where it starts to get interesting. It is very much like any of the other ones, which would be, at the end of the day, what the courts are going to look at are the principles of contract. Is this a valid and binding contract? And often maher agreements are standard form contracts, where you just fill in the blank.
So like a boilerplate agreement.
Yep. Often they're boilerplate agreements. But the courts are going to look at the parties bargaining. They're going to look at the contract. The voluntary standard. Was this voluntary? Is it conscionable? And they're going to look at that no matter where the agreement was written. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking that's like someone, who's developing, who's signing a prenup when, in terms of was it voluntary and conscionable? Is it someone that's been presented to this hours before they're getting married? Or is someone provided the fairness of developing this, weeks or months before they got married? There's a difference in terms of the stress levels.
That's the point, that it's exactly like a maher contract, or a maher agreement is exactly like any other domestic contract. And its enforceability depends on of the specific facts of that case. It's the precise wording of the maher. It's the circumstances of the execution, just like you discussed. Was there any duress? Was it right before the actual wedding ceremony? Was there disclosure? Are there any facts that would suggest anything unconscionable? The courts are going to look at it like any other prenuptial agreement, and these are the aspects that will inform the analysis.
Yeah, important. So, in terms of Muslim divorce, there's this perception that if the husband says to the wife, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you" 3 times, that they get divorced. That's not really the case. And how does that work in North America?
Well, it depends, right? That is a way to get divorced in some countries under some culture. I can't speak to many of them. It's not a culture that I have. I am a Smiley. And we follow the laws of the land. So we would get divorced much like any other Canadian would. And in fact, if you want to be divorced in Canada, you need to follow the same procedure that anybody else does, and that would be getting a divorce through the courts. Okay,
so I think that's a really important statement to understand is no matter what your cultural beliefs are, the country that you're getting divorced in...
that dictates your divorce.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And you have to make sure that you're eligible to be divorced. Like in Canada, you have to have been resident here a year in order to get a divorce.
Oh, okay. So you can't just come to Canada with your spouse and all of a sudden it doesn't work out. There are all these cultural differences, or maybe you had problems in your marriage beforehand. And you can't just say 6 months after being here, I'm getting divorced.
No, you need to be resident in Ontario for a year. And to get a divorce, chances are you'd have to be separated for a year as well. There are other grounds, but that's the most popular ground.
Okay. And I would expect that it's the same thing across North America.
Yeah. Or similar.
Similar. Yeah.
Terms,
Yeah. 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 What about if your spouse was in another country and you're in Canada or the US, would the maher still be enforceable?
Yes. So is it enforceable? Yes. Can you get an order that requires it to be paid? Yes. The question would be, how would you enforce that order? So you'd need to have it enforced. Depends where the assets are. If there's assets in North America, then you could probably attach to those. It depends where the payor is and where the assets are, but the interjurisdictional aspect doesn't change the nature of the contract. The contract is, if it's enforceable, if it meets the requirements for enforceability, then it's enforceable. It's like any other contract. It doesn't matter where the parties are. Chances are the agreement will discuss which country's laws are going to govern, like other prenuptial agreements.
Right.
I have to say the maher agreements have also changed over time to deal with some of these issues when courts have raised these issues. So, when you talked about maher agreements that are made in Canada or elsewhere, the Canadian maher agreements have changed to respond to the court's decisions here, as I would expect in other places in North America. So recently, the Canadian courts have seen several other maher agreements that were entered into in different parts of the world. Some of them are upheld and some of them are not.
Right. Oh, I see. Interesting. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is so important that, we should have our listeners be attuned to in terms of the maher?
The only thing I tell your listeners is, if they're family law professionals, that they need to educate themselves about this.
Yeah.
So that they can, so they're not doing their clients a disservice. And to the clients, make sure if this is a concern to you or something that's important to you, make sure you find professionals, whether they're lawyers or social workers or financial professionals, that they understand these issues so that you can be well served.
That's great. What about then from an emotional perspective? Because divorce has become a social norm in North America. I think it's more looked down upon in other countries. How do you manage that when you have come from another country where you're in, now you're an immigrant in Canada? Divorce is handled so differently. How do you counsel someone in terms of the cultural differences?
The cultural differences is huge. The way I think about it, the main difference to me is, or one of the ways to bring some meaning to the differences is whether or not the individuals come from an individualistic culture or a collectivist culture.
Meaning?
A collectivist culture, individualistic culture puts the individual above the collective.
Yeah.
It's predominantly the North American culture.
Okay.
Whereas a collectivist culture defines culture, it defines collectivists prioritize group goals, family, the community over individual goals. They value, harmony, and they tend to take relationships, obligations. I think they're obligations to the collective very seriously.
So we're going to have another conversation on this, because I can see that this is like another hour conversation. Because now that I think about it, when you look at cultural diversity and what does that mean? For instance, in the Japanese culture, you have to save face, and saving face to someone who's an immigrant from Japan, in North America, how does that impact the way they approach the divorce process?
And Japanese are a very collectivist culture.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there are, it's the misunderstandings that happen. In one culture, holding your tongue is considered maturity. In another culture, it's considered avoidance. Right? In the Japanese culture, it's immature to certain ways that are just misunderstood. And I think in the same way, there's misunderstandings about divorce. I think when you think about the individualistic and the collectivist culture, divorce is considered exile from a community at the end of the day.
Yes, you're losing all of those ties.
And if you come from a collectivist culture, then it really changes psychologically. It's difficult because you lose your sense of who you are.
It's so important. And
do you know which culture has the lowest divorce level?
I don't. Do you know the answer to that, Steve?
No, I really don't. How about you, Deb?
Oh.
I mean, it's an interesting question, though.
It is interesting. I have no idea.
You need to find that out.
Yeah.
Well, I think then you'd end up having questions about why. Like, why? Does that mean that they're happier, or that there's more harmony, or does that mean that it's
The
more
pressure.
important? Yeah, it's more important to stay married.
Well, and I thought of that because you brought up the saving faith. For some people, that's very important.
Mm-hmm. And for some people, I mean, even if they're in an unhappy marriage, they don't want to lose their place in the community. They don't want to lose. It's, and some people, they misunderstand it as a sign of subservience or submission. But the fact is that the woman might be unwilling to give up the security she derives from her place in the family and her community.
Yeah, but that's also a very North American concept. You know what? It's a very couples-oriented society. And, like, let's face it, that's the way it's a Noah's Ark society. So doesn't matter what your faith is or what your religious beliefs are. I think that there are many people that just adhere to that concept that I'm going to stay no matter what. I need that support. And let's face it, in today's economy, it gets very expensive to divorce.
There are so many factors. Yes, finances is definitely one of them.
So, Fareen, I know that we could discuss this for hours, and we're going to definitely have you back on to discuss cultural fluency, because I think it's critical to understand. And I think that it's really important, too, when you're going through divorce and you are of a different culture, but yet divorcing in North America, to educate your legal counsel or your therapist in terms of the way you perceive different, going not necessarily the way you perceive, but the way that you approach certain values.
Absolutely. I always say don't make assumptions across the board. Don't make assumptions of your lawyer. Don't make assumptions that they understand or don't understand because they're of a certain background or culture. And in the same way, lawyers don't make assumptions of your clients.
And it's so easy to do that. Don't you find that people are too easy to bring their own bias into a situation?
Oh, absolutely. The mind creates unconscious patterns, even where there are none.
Interesting. I've never really thought about that.
It's unconscious. It happens in a blink of an eye. Well, Malcolm Gladwell, blink,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
It happens in a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
It's unconscious. The mind creates the patterns, whether or not they exist.
And I guess, when you look at body language or the way people communicate or someone standing in your personal space, I know that Europeans, their personal space boundaries are much smaller than we have in North America. So there's so many different things to think about when you apply all of these concepts to divorce. And someone who's divorcing outside of their cultural norms, it must be very difficult.
Oh, absolutely. Intercultural communication is a whole other different discussion entirely. They did some studies. The University of Florida did some studies about couples having coffee in cities around the world. And in London, couples rarely touch each other. In Paris, 110 touches per coffee. Wow. And in San Juan, they had 180 touches per coffee. Like, it's just, that's proximity is a huge cultural communicator. It communicates so much.
So I'd like to know who's sitting there and like marking off the number of dishes.
Then this is from the University of Florida. That's a course I want to sign up for. No, it's you're absolutely right. In Europe, right, or in other parts of the world, they talk eyeball to eyeball. How close? What does distance mean? Does it mean aloofness or disinterest? Does it mean, or is it just what's the norm? Or it's comfort levels too.
So, and that would make a really big difference when you have, when you were raised in a different country and you have a different culture, when you're working with a lawyer that's, has not been exposed to that before. And so their perceptions of you must be very different and a bit skewed.
Absolutely. And that's why it's all about not making assumptions and not being afraid to ask questions and not being ashamed to clarify issues.
I see. I think that's really important then. As a parting thought for our listeners is that if you really don't understand something, that your lawyer is trying to tell you, don't be afraid to ask. And if you have a difference of opinion, you need to discuss that, especially if you have different beliefs. And if you look at things from a very different perspective. Any other thoughts for our listeners, Fareen?
No, that's everything. This has been a fascinating discussion. There's so much more to say.
And well, you're definitely going to be on. We'll have you back for sure. So again, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
All right. So if you want to get a hold of Fareen, the website is balesbeal.com. That's BALESBEALL.com.
And I have it on the liner notes, Fareen's email address.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, what do you think?
Wow. And like you said, we could have gone on for a long time.
Yeah, there's another 3 shows that we do, isn't it? And it's yet so relevant because, let's face it, not everyone is, from a North American culture.
Right. It's more relevant every year, it seems, as we become a more diverse society.
Well, when you look at Canada, I just want to go back to some statistics. I saw something that Fareen had written, which just in the city of Toronto or Ontario, let me just find it.
And while you look that up, I want to tell our audience, if you want to get a hold of Fareen, you can go to the website of Bales Beal, which is balesbeal.com. That's BALESBEALL.com.
Yeah. Okay. Listen to these statistics in Ontario. Over 20% of Ontario's residents are described as visible minorities by Stats Canada. That's comprising of over 2.7 million people. Over 6% are South Asian, nearly 5% are Chinese, and nearly 4% are Black. Approximately 46% of Toronto's residents are members of visible communities. So, and well over 60% of the country's population growth occurs through immigration. So you can just imagine then across Canada, across the US, how culturally diverse we are. Right. And so when you are coming from someplace else, or you're raised in a family with beliefs that are different than what you are, different than the North American beliefs, which you probably incorporate a lot in terms of what you believe in, but in the value system. But when you try to support some of the your culture, within your family values, it's so different.
Yeah. Well, again, fascinating show. And for our listeners who want to get more on you, Deb, it's thesmartdivorce.com. And you've still got your toolkit there, which is flying off the shelves.
It is flying off the shelves. But what's exciting about it, too, is you can download it. So if you don't want the hard copy, check out the website under the Smart Divorce Toolkit and look for it in downloadable version now, too.
Great. Good deal. And you've been listening to Deborah Moskovich on the Smart Divorce Radio Show. Deborah, always a pleasure. As always, I hope the program helped you. If you have a comment or question you'd like to ask us, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave us a voicemail on our listener line at area code 248-686-2256. Or drop us an email with your question or comment to divorcesourceradio@gmail.com. New programs are available every week on divorcesourceradio.com, as well as iTunes, BlackBerry, Stitcher, and all over the web. If you'd like to be notified when new programs are available, you can follow us on Twitter. Our follow word is Divorce Source. Also, if you're not listening from our website, I invite you to stop by divorcesourceradio.com, where you'll find a complete program archive. If you're looking for a specific subject, simply type it into our search engine, and chances are you'll find what you're looking for. We also have other resources available at our website as well. And while you're on our website, click on the Facebook icon and join the growing Divorce Source Radio Facebook community. Thanks for listening. Until next time, make it a great week and stay healthy. I'm Steve Peck.